Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Breaking Bad Season 1. This video is part of a series of videos where I cover every single episode of Breaking Bad, one season at a time. In this video I will be covering Season 1 of Breaking Bad. So, first thing I need to talk about as far as my personal experience with Breaking Bad goes is that, like most people, I will say I came to this show well after it was airing because a lot of people recommended it to me, saying this show's amazing. This is a period in my life where it was before streaming service were that big, especially in New Zealand where I lived, and I wasn't really watching TV. I didn't have cable or TV or anything, so I was really out of touch with new shows. So I basically, at this point in time, I would rent DVD collections from the video store, and the only way that I really heard about shows is from recommendations of what people were saying. So people started recommending Breaking Bad, and eventually I got around to watching it. I think it was while the fourth season of Breaking Bad was airing, but for some reason the DVD store that I would rent from only had the first two seasons of Breaking Bad, so I had to be a bit more creative in how I watched season 3 and 4. But I did rent the season 1 DVD and was somewhat impressed by season 1 of Breaking Bad. I will say I was not blown away. In fact, looking back at it in retrospect, from a modern perspective, I do think that I always say that Breaking Bad gets better every season. So I think the first season's kind of the weakest of the entire show, and the second season gets better, and the third season's better than that, and the fourth season's better than that, and the fifth season's a fucking masterpiece. But I'll get there. So it improves upon itself one up. So I do, and in fact I've met some people that tried to get into this show, but they couldn't get past the first season because it's like, this show's not all that great. But I was like, you gotta understand that it builds, like it gets better and better and better. You can't really judge it off of this first season. Now, not to say this first season was bad, but I will say a lot of people, and in fact including myself, after watching the first season, would compare the show to the show Weeds, which is kind of had the opposite effect, where the first couple seasons were good, but then it kept going and going and going and kept getting worse and worse and worse, which honestly is what most shows do. But anyway, Weeds is a decent show. I liked it. Breaking Bad is like a billion times better. It's only a billion times better. So, like, after I watched the entire show, Breaking Bad, and someone, like, watches the first season, I'm like, oh, this is just like Weeds. My first reaction to that is to be like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, this show is like a billion times better than Weeds. But if I had to, put myself back in the perspective of knowing nothing about this show and just watching the first season, I have to remember that I actually had the same reaction. And I think in watching this first season again, I do think it is. Now, if you're not familiar with the show Weeds, it was a Showtime show where it was about a mother in her 40s who was selling marijuana. Hence the term Weeds. And of course, eventually her drug dealing habits got her into trouble, and she got involved with cartels and the FBI and blah blah blah. So I do see the similarities here, especially how the first episode plays it like this is just a middle-aged average high school teacher. And so I could see, and that's how Weeds played it, as she was just your average suburban mother. But the show, like, really diverges, and you do learn later that there's a whole lot more to Walter White than that he's not just your typical suburban high school teacher father. That this underling, his life is a lot more complex than that. Now, the other thing about this season that you may notice is that it's very short. In fact, I remember when I first watched the DVD and I got to the season finale and the season ended, I was like, okay, let's play the next episode. And there was no next episode. I was like, what? This can't be right. So I looked at the DVD box and sure enough, yeah, that was the last episode. That was it. I'm like, really? And I was like, that didn't seem like any sort of closure whatsoever. Now, I have no idea why it didn't occur to me then, and in fact I just found out very recently, and this is like a no duh type situation. I don't know why I didn't figure this out a lot sooner, but I found out very, very recently that this season aired during the writer's strike, and that's why it was cut short due to a writer's strike. And yeah, that makes sense. And so they didn't plan for that final episode to be the finale. They'd planned to, and you could really tell too, because it actually feels like it's building to the next episode. That's one of those setup type episode deals. But they couldn't account for the writer's strike hitting, and that cut their season short. Now, I always think of this writer's strike as the Lost season 4. Because that was the main show I was watching at the time. I suppose there was also Hero season 2, which I watched, but that show wasn't that good. But Lost was the main show I was watching at the time of this writer's strike, and it was season 4, and they cut it short. But Lost, after the writer's strike, they returned with I think like 5 episodes to finish up the season, because it was a hit show and people wanted the story of the season to be finished up and they didn't want to mess up their story too badly. Whereas with other shows, and especially like a show like this, which in its first season was not very popular, no one had really heard of it. And so I understand, like, once the writer's strike hit, then that was it for that season. They had to wait till the next season. So yeah, it's a really short season in retrospect, which could be part of the reason why it doesn't quite hold up to the rest of the series. But I do think that the show does get better and better each season. Anyway, let me jump into the episodes. Let's start with the first episode, creatively entitled Pilot. And I gotta be honest, when this episode did draw me into the show. When I first saw this episode, I was like, this could be a movie. Like, if I went to the video store and rent a movie in a DVD and I popped it up and it was just this episode and that was it, it was like one self-contained 2-hour movie, I thought it would have worked. I would have loved it. I thought, hey, this is a decent movie. So I was actually really impressed. Because I do think this is, even though it does leave it a bit open-ended at the end. I think if they made it a movie, they would have to give a little bit more closure. But then, of course, it's not a movie, it's a show, so they have to leave it a little open-ended. So, this, of course, introduces to the whole situation with Walter White getting cancer and deciding and going on a sort of, what do they call it, ride along with his brother-in-law, who's a DEA agent, and then he sees like how much money that people make creating crystal meth, and he thinks, well, he knows a lot about chemistry, so he can do it. So he teams up with Jesse, and they get into some shenanigans with trying to sell it, and then they end up, these drug dealers try to kill them, and so they're very creative in getting out of it. Now, the whole structures of this episode is really creative, and especially how it begins, especially like beginning the entire show by showing Walter White, like the very first scene of the entire show is him freaking out with like no pants on in the middle of the desert and talking, and you hear sirens in the background. He gets his gun ready to go out in a blaze of glory. Like, that is an absolute amazing way to start your show, like, let alone in a single episode, but to start your entire show that way, that is a hook. And I think that made it very clear that the showrunners, the writers, and everyone involved in the show knew exactly what they were doing, and that this was going to be a really tightly written masterpiece overall. And so that's why I think this plays out. It could be a movie in its own right, because the whole structure of it, how it begins that way, it's kind of a cheat that some shows do, where they show like a part of something that happens later on in the story, and they start with that, and then they work your way backwards and build back up to it, which doesn't always work, to be honest. There's a lot of examples where I see shows trying to do that. I think of that Voyager episode, The Fight, which is the worst episode of Voyager, or one of them, which tried to do it that way, and it was a fucking disaster. But there's other examples. I think most of this story structures that try to do it this way, I want to say don't work. Because it does feel too gimmicky, and it does feel like, oh yeah, they just want to start with something action-packed, so they have to show something later and work their way back up. But I think this is probably the best use, or the best example of that. I just think it really, really works. First of all, because it does get you knowing what's coming, and that's going to end up in him like in this crazy situation. I think it's very important, because the way it begins, where he's just a mundane high school teacher, like, that gives you a false impression. Like, if they began with that without showing you that scene, that would give you a really false impression on what the story of the episode is about and what the show is going to be about. So I think that was actually an absolutely brilliant way to begin the show. So yeah, I think it does a great job in setting up the premise of the show. The whole thing about the high school teacher learning to cook crystal meth, but he knows a hell of a lot about science. I like of course, they had the dynamic between Jesse and Walt, which is a very good dynamic, because Jesse's an idiot as far as science goes. He flunked out of class. He's doing everything all wrong. He's with chili powder and whatnot. And Walter is like a genius with chemicals and treats him like a moron. But on the flip side of that, Walter is completely out of his element. Like, he's a moron when it comes to like the criminal underworld and actually dealing with, let's say, stuff that is below the law or illegal, and that he's totally ignorant now of his element in that. But Jesse knows a hell of a lot more, although he's not a genius as far as that goes either, which is evident in this episode where he gets the crap beat out of him and ends up provoking Crazy 8 and Emilio. I don't know if I'll talk a bit. I guess I'll talk a little bit about Better Call Saul. This is one of the reasons why I want to watch Breaking Bad again, to be perfectly honest, is because of Better Call Saul, because there's tons of references. It's been years since I've seen it, and so I miss a lot of it. Crazy 8, we do get to see in Better Call Saul. In fact, we get to learn how he got his name, Crazy 8. It had to do something with the poker game. And it's funny seeing that, because in this episode they kind of make, and the next couple episodes they make fun of how his name is Crazy 8, and particularly Walter White. And it's like, what kind of fucking name is that? But actually seeing the Better Call Saul episode where he got his name, plus like he was kind of a shy, unassuming type years prior to this in the Better Call Saul era. And he actually got to build up to that. And another thing is, and this is something mentioned in the next couple episodes, is that Hank refers to him as his snitch, which is something I forgot totally about. And we actually see in Better Call Saul that he does become an informant for Hank, but it's because of Lalo's actually using him to get at Gus Fring. And of course, that is getting way ahead of the Breaking Bad timeline, but that's very interesting. And I had totally forgot about that when I saw the Better Call Saul episode where he became the snitch, that they referred to him as the snitch. But anyway, yeah, so I really love this pilot episode. I thought it was maybe not, I wouldn't say like one of the best episodes ever, but it was definitely a really great way to start the show. So, let's move over to the next episode, which is The Cat's in the Bag, which deals with the aftermath of the pilot, which, quite, plain and simple, Walt and Jesse got a couple bodies to deal with. One alive, one not. And so they have to basically kidnap, well, I don't know if kidnap's the right term, but really imprison, I think is a better term, this drug dealer who they're afraid if they let go is going to kill them, and their fears are 100% justified. And the other drug dealer who did die, they have to dispose of his body, and it's about Walt and Jesse basically arguing over how to do that, and they eventually come to flip a coin, and it decides that Walt has to deal with Crazy 8, who's still alive, and Jesse will dispose of the dead body, which he does a terrible job at. And of course, this gets into a lot of the character stuff with Skyler, who's becoming suspicious of Walt, and eventually finds out that about Jesse before for tracking him down, and Walt lies and says he's he's dealing him marijuana. Now, I think this is as good as time as any to get into Skyler, because apparently it's common amongst the Breaking Bad fan base and those who really like the show to completely hate and despise Skyler. It's a common theme. I never really shared that. I never really like when I watched the show on my own, I didn't really get that until later I heard about it. I was never a huge fan of her, though, because she is like the stereotypical nagging wife, and it does feel like she is very controlling, like that she tries to constantly control Walt's every move, which I think contributes to his downfall, his character, which I'll talk more about a bit later on, where he feels the need to take control of his life and in a very toxic and negative way. And I think a lot of it had to do with her kind of controlling nature. And particularly this episode when she tracks down Jesse is just like, it does seem like she really needs to be controlling of Walt and get all up in his shit. But I'll get into... I actually don't agree with all the hatred that Skyler gets. I think it is a bit too far. Like the Honest Trailer was making fun of this, pointing out that her husband was becomes like this drug dealing gangster who kills people and like holds her hostage and shit. But no, she's the bad one. She's the bad guy. And who's constantly lying and toxic, whatever. Which is a good point, but I think most people were boiling it down to like this first part before Walter White became like a, murdering crime lord or whatever you want to call him. At this point in time when he was just a high school teacher, she was very sort of controlling and I think a negative influence for him, and I think that actually contributed to his downfall. But I do disagree with the common sentiment that she is a terrible, terrible character and people want the horrible things to happen to her. I think that is unjustified. I think, and I'll get more into how I actually see from her perspective a bit later on. There's another episode that I think really showcased that. But as for this episode, this really showcases the slow pace after that really high octane pilot. This showcases like the slower pace that the show would come accustomed to, which is nothing wrong. Like I think they do slow pace really well. Like Better Call Saul will slow it down even more. But yeah, it shows you the kind of, because they basically split this story into 2 episodes, because this episode is basically only the first part, because it deals with, because Crazy 8's still alive, it just deals with, it ends with Jesse like being a moron and burning the body in acid in a tub, where Walt specifically asked him to get plastic for a reason, and the tub, like, it breaks through the ceiling, which was a funny scene. Anyway, so this is a good episode, a decent episode. It's like not amazing, but I do like it. So let's get into the next episode, which is "And the Bag is in the River." Of course, you know, in the last episode, the cat's in the bag and the bag is in the river. Get it? It makes up the thing. But anyway, I like this episode better, of course, because it's a really defining moment for Walt. It's the first time he kills someone, and it really deals with him struggling to deal with having to kill someone, and that he really, really doesn't want to. And of course, Jesse also doesn't want to, which is, again, this is another aspect of his character which we explored more as the show goes, that even though he's seen as this really shady, criminal type who like cooks meth and is uneducated and doesn't give a shit about anyone, that he's actually got a really, really kind heart, and that he's really nice person deep down. And so he is really appalled at the concept of having to kill someone as well, and it's because of the coin flip. He went to Walter. He's like, "Coin flip is sacred." Like, that was a bit silly, but anyway, so Jesse starts to get really irritated with the fact that Walt is kind of procrastinating and leaving Crazy 8 alive, mooning in his basement of his house, while Walt gets to go home in his comfy home with his family, and Jesse has to deal with this like a mooning gangster type in his basement. And so Walt is looking for any reason he can to find an excuse not to kill him, and so he has this nice conversation with them, and he talks about his father and the store he owned. And I think and he talks about how he went to college and he was a musician. So I think this gets into the character as we meet him in Better Call Saul, where he was more sort of unassuming and whatnot. Again, Better Call Saul is such a perfect prequel. Really takes minor details of Breaking Bad and accentuates it, and it stays so true to the show. But I'll get to that when I'll cover Better Call Saul. But anyway, so he sort of relates with Walt and has this really nice conversation. Walter's like, "Okay, I'll let you go," and I think Walter did let himself be deceived, because he was like, when he said, if I let you go, you'll just leave me alone. He's like, "Yeah, sure, live and let live," is what I say. I think it was quite foolish to be fooled by that, because it's very obvious that he's not going to do that. Like, I don't think he oversold it, is what I'm trying to say, is that he should have said something like, "Look, I'm going to need something from you, you're going to have to do this, and then we'll be square." But him saying, "No, it's all good, man, live and let live," is an obvious lie. He's obviously not going to be okay with the fact that they killed his cousin, and that they held him captive for several days. It's not going to be something he's just going to be, "Oh, it's all good, man." Like, he should have, Walt, but as I said, Walt let himself be deceived, because he wanted so desperately to not kill him. He was looking for any excuse not to kill him, but he came back, reality came flooding back in, when he looked at the broken plate and realized there was a missing piece. And this was such a great scene, where he was like, no, why the fuck would you do this? Why would you do this? Because all of his excuses are gone. He had a very veiled, thin excuse not to kill him, to let him go, but reality came crashing back in, and he realized that the Crazy 8 was going to kill him. And it does make me think that, from Crazy 8's perspective, taking the broken plate maybe not the smartest thing to do. Maybe he should have just pretended like, "Oh, it's all good," and left the house once Walt let him. It's like, oh yeah, man, it's all good. And then came back later with a bunch of gangsters and then killed the fuck out of Walt. He could have done it that way, which actually would have worked out a lot better for him. But then again, we wouldn't have a show if it did it that way. So he had to fight, like giving the plate. I guess he let his own anger get the better of him, and he wanted instant gratification to kill Walt immediately, which shows that he wasn't the smartest gangster either. And plus, he underestimated Walt, which is something that was very, very clear. Although the way he manipulated him with trying to take his guard down was done really well. But I suppose he still underestimated Walt. So taking the plate was definitely a bad idea and did lead directly to his death. But goddamn, that was such a powerful scene when Walt had to kill him. And as I said, it's a defining moment for his character that he had to murder someone in cold blood like that. Because it was kind of a stripping away of the naivete. Because in the first episode, it was more like, oh yeah, I'm a chemist. I can create crystal meth like chemicals. Yeah, and I can make shitloads of money. That's simple. Which is a really naive way to look at it, because there's a lot more involved with doing something that is illegal and run by criminal enterprises and shady types, and you have to get involved with that. And this is sort of a wake-up call to that. So then he actually had to murder someone. Now, granted, he did kill Amelia first with the powder, but that was different. That was kind of like a self-defense kind of thing, and all he had to do was like throw in some powder in the thing and run out the door. I mean, they did shoot at him through the door, so that was traumatic, but it was still more of a self-defense, life or death sort of thing, where this was, I mean, you could argue it's self-defense because Amelia had the plate, but he was holding a man captive, like tied him up to a wall with the bicycle lock around his neck, and then had to strangle him in cold blood. It was a hell of a lot more visceral, and it's something I think that he would never had expected. So then we get into the next couple episodes, because that actually shows his reaction to realizing that, because he didn't realize that he would have to murder a man in cold blood like that, and so it put him off the whole prospect of being involved in this, because he didn't know all this shit was involved, so he wanted nothing to do with it, which makes sense for his character, but is actually quite boring as far to watch on a TV show. So we'll get to the next episode, which is Cancer Man, which I actually think when I did the top 5 worst episodes of the show that I put this one on there. I don't know if it's quite that bad, although the show's so great, maybe comparatively speaking, it would make a worse list because all the episodes are so amazing. But it's definitely my least favorite of the season. It is a really boring episode, I'm sorry to say. This is where the slow pace of the show really starts to hurt it. And in fact, when I first watched the show, I thought maybe the show was like losing its steam. It's like it only had like a good first start with 3 episodes, but then it was going to become a bit of a mess and lose its direction. But I mean, it does make sense for his character that he, after having that traumatic experience, that he would want to stay the hell away from. In fact, if it was a real life smart person, that's what they do. After having an experience like that, they would be like, that was a mistake. I had no idea what would actually be involved in doing this criminal activity. I was totally unprepared for it, so I'm staying the fuck away. So it makes sense. But it makes for boring TV. Especially the way, I mean, they could have. Here's the thing, like, they could have had this character arc, which makes sense, but glossed over it. It's like the whole saying when you make a movie or show, if you show someone changing a tire, you don't need to show them, like, get out of the car, get out the jack from the trunk, put the jack under the thing, and heist up the tire, take the tire off, put another tire back on, take the jack down, put it back in the trunk, get in the car. If most movies would show them, get out of the car, take the jack out of the trunk, and then they cut to him getting back in the car and driving away, because that implies that they changed the tire without having to go through all the boring, tedious motions of actually seeing him take all the steps to change the tire. That's kind of how I feel about this episode. That they could have, implied that he had this character journey, which he needed, which made a lot of sense, but without seeing all the tedious motions. And this is also the episode where he came out to his family about having cancer because he was hiding it, which I forgot the fact that he hid it, and I think that's annoying, but it does make sense for his character. He's very prideful. So that's interesting, but again, we didn't need to spend that much time on it, I think, and this entire episode goes without him cooking meth. The only interaction he has with Jesse is when Jesse comes over to try to get him to come back, and he's like, "Get the fuck out of here," which again, not very interesting television, even though it makes sense for his character. So I think. And plus, the thing I think is the worst aspect of this episode is the Jesse storyline, where he goes back to his family, tries to reconnect with his parents, even though it's, as I said, it's good character writing. It makes sense that his parents he would have parents like that who were just at the end of the rope because he's made so many mistakes and he keeps fucking up, and they want to love him, but they just can't. That all makes sense, but man, it's fucking boring to see, especially the whole thing with his little brother and how he actually had the pot. Who cares? This is actually, it was the hardest episodes for me to watch in a rewatch. Now again, I'm not saying this is a terrible episode, because all the character beats are well done and they make sense for the characters and they help drive the story. I just think it doesn't need to be this slow. It doesn't need to be just drawn out. We don't need to see the guy get out of his car and put the jack on his and take out the tire. They could have cut to a place, implied that all this stuff happened, and it would have worked just as well. Better. Much better, actually. So, not a fan of this episode. So, let me get to the next episode, which is Gray Matter. Now, this episode got a lot to say about it. So, when I first saw the show, I kind of grouped it in with the previous episode where, this is a bit boring and it's taking too long. It's about him finally getting back to cook meth, which I think he does at the end of the episode. But I have a totally different perspective on it now, and especially after watching the entire show. I think I watched a YouTube video that claimed that this was the most important episode of the entire show. And I don't know if I'd phrase it that way, but I actually really agree with that. I think the way I would phrase it more is this is the quintessential episode of the entire show. This is basically, it's a show-defining episode. Even more so than the pilot. Okay, so if you don't know what I'm talking about, this is the episode where Walt goes to a party with his old friends that he went to college with, who are billionaires because they have this company, whatever, I don't know what the fuck they do, but it has something to do with chemistry, and that Walt originally was involved in, but because he was romantically involved with the woman, she broke up with him and got together with the other guy. He kind of had to step away from for emotional reasons. But they went on to become billionaires, and he's just a poor high school teacher. And he's kind of this is illustrated when he's talking to Elliot's friends, and how they're just oh, so what university you're at? He's let's change the subject. This shows kind of how his life really took a dive compared to his friends. And this is something they'll get into a lot more later on in the show. As I said, this will become the defining characteristic. Mainly because this illustrates why he went to sell meth. I mean, the pilot, Well, the couple episodes after the pilot primarily dealt with the aftermath of dealing with the dead bodies, and the last episode, was just about him coming out to his family about having cancer and denying to be a part of the criminal world. But in the pilot episode, he was it was about, and this is where I think most people get confused on. Because there's so there's this meme. I actually posted because I thought it was funny, and the social commentary it makes I completely agree with. But there's this meme about, if Breaking Bad took place in Canada, and Walter White goes to the doctor and says, and the doctor's like, "You have cancer." And it's like, "But don't worry, it's all taken care of. It's covered by the health insurance." It's like, "Oh, great! So I don't have to go and cook meth or something. I can just have it." And I think there was. You could also say for Australia. I think there was another one that said Australia or UK or New Zealand or basically any other country in the world that's an industrialized country in the world has this kind of universal healthcare. And this show actually is very American in its nature, particularly this episode. But here's the thing about that meme, is because that's looking at it from the perspective of the pilot, of the reason why he wanted to cook meth and get involved in all his criminal activities, because he needed the money to pay for his treatments and to leave his family after he died. Because, having cancer, being terminally ill in America could bankrupt people. And so that meme does speak to that. But that's actually not really the premise of the show. That's actually not really why Walter White becomes Heisenberg, will become this huge crime lord. The real reason is explained in this episode, Gray Matter. Because, and they make it very clear, it's not simply, he can't afford medical. I mean, that's part of it. That's why he first got involved, that he can't afford the medical treatment. He wants to have money to leave his family. But, and this is something that later seasons will explore a lot more when he eventually admits that it had nothing to do with his family, that he did it for himself. And this episode is what really sets the stage for that. Because here you have a situation where Elliot, his friend, offers him a job at his company because he rightfully, and nothing he says is lying. Nothing he says isn't true. He's like, you helped create this company. You're a genius. And you could really bring a lot to the table. I don't think he's lying. I don't think he is placating Walt. It sounds from a place of sincerity. But as soon as, and Walt's flattered at first, but as soon as Elliot mentions he knows about the cancer, Walt immediately jumps to, he's just pitying me. This is charity. And in fact, it gets even worse when Elliot outright says, you don't even have to work for us, we'll give you the money anyway, which is the biggest insult to Walt. And that's the thing. Walt is not a good person. He's not a victim. And this is something that the show will make clear as the show goes on. That he's a very prideful person. And his pride really, especially in this episode, really, really got the better of him. To the point where it ruined his life. And it turned him into a villain, basically. And this is why I say the show is very American, not because of the health insurance thing, which, that's part of it, but it has to do with the American mindset of despising charity, and that anyone who doesn't earn their own keep is a leech, is a despisable, the people who I think personally are demonized the most in American culture are those who are on welfare, those who take charity, they're seen as lazy, poor, relying on handouts for other people who don't make their way. They're the people who are most despised and looked down upon. And the American mindset is you have to make your own way. You have to be the king of your own household and all that. And Walt is completely steeped in that mindset. Now, it's part of what I mentioned is part of it is due to the fact that he has been controlled. He has a very overbearing, controlling wife, which I do think contributed to that mindset. But getting back to the whole Skyler thing, because I said I'd defend her a bit later on, and that's in this episode, because watching this episode, it made it clear to me that although Skyler's sort of overbearingness and need to control Walt did help contribute to this mindset, I do see her, especially in this episode, as the victim. Because I completely sided with her, because she was just like telling Elliot, look, my husband has cancer, a friend of the family. And Walt gets really pissed off, really defensive. How dare you spread my personal thing? And how he outright refuses to accept charity. He thinks it's the lowest of the low of the low, and he's an asshole to her. So this is why I disagree with the people who think that Skyler is the worst character ever, and she should just die, and she's overbearing. Because although she has her faults, I will definitely admit, I think this episode makes it clear that she is, in the overall story of the show, of the entire show, she's the victim. Walt is the villain. And I think that's made very clear in this episode. Particularly because here's the thing. The aspect of taking charity is so vile to him, which again I think is a fucked up American mindset. It is something that's very wrong with the American culture. But it's so vile. His pride is so huge that he'd rather die than do it. And of course, his family rightfully calls him out on that. They had that intervention, which is a pretty funny scene. This is the thing about Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, is that it has a very subdued undertone of comedy. It's very comedic, and it flows so perfectly into the show most people don't even notice. I mean, there's a reason why a lot of the actors that get to play role are comedians, like freaking God, why am I blanking on his name? That's so terrible of me. Bryan Cranston. He was a comedic actor at this stage. This is the first really... I mean, he appeared in one episode of X-Files where he's dramatic, and maybe he's in a couple other things, but mostly as a comedic actor, he's known for comedy. And then all the other actors they bring in, like Bob Odenkirk and the guy who plays Huel, and they had the other Boston comedian, Bill Burr, they keep getting comedians. And the reason why is because there is a comedic undertone to this show that's actually on the surface very deathly serious and deals with very heavy issues and deals with them very well, and it's a very strong character story and intricate, but underneath there's this comedic undertone which really sometimes goes unnoticed because it's so subtle, and I love that. I think this is an amazing thing. But anyway, I'm talking about the scene where they had the intervention, which is a funny scene. But it also gets into, as I said, Walt would rather die than take charity or be pitied. And his family rightfully calls him out on that shit. Especially Skyler. Marie kind of sides with him, which was funny. And then Hank, his whole base with his sports analogy is what the fuck are you even talking about, Hank? That was funny. But anyway, and Walt tries to make a plea look, this should be my choice, blah, blah, blah. But really, I think it's bullshit. I think it all comes down to he's way too prideful, and he's letting his pride get away to the point where he would rather die than is not only taking charity, but also having to go through the chemotherapy, and suffering and stuff. He makes it about, I don't want to spend my last days suffering, which is something I can get behind. But I think that is misframing the situation, particularly his motivation. I think it's a cop out. It's not the real reason. The real reason is that he's too prideful to suffer and too prideful to take charity. But then it becomes clear, I think because he accepts the fact that he can go through the chemotherapy. In fact, I love how Walt Jr. called him out as a coward. Because Walt Jr. lived his whole life with this disability, and he's like so afraid of going through this, the suffering, that he's willing to die over it. But of course, that's not the real situation. I think Walt Jr. calling him out like that did make him think, yeah, I'm being cowardly. And again, his pride is like, I can't be cowardly. I have to put up with this pain and suffer through it. But that, as I said, that wasn't the real issue. And so that's why he overcame that part of it, because that wasn't the deal breaker for him. The deal breaker was taking charity, was letting someone else pay for it, was being dependent on someone else, taking a handout, which was a very vile and just unacceptable concept to Walt. And it really shows the flaw in his character. I mean, a huge flaw. I mean, this guy is a flawed person. He's not a good person. It was a huge flaw in his character. I don't know how else to put that. And so he found a way where, okay, so I'll suffer through, I'll be brave and suffer through the chemotherapy, but I'm not fucking taking the charity. So he found a workaround, because he could see how this was breaking his family up, and so he wanted to support them and appease them, but he would not fucking take the charity. So his workaround was to say, okay, I'll take the charity, that's fine, we'll go through it, but in actuality not take the charity, instead cook meth. And that's what his driving motivation for the rest of the show. That's what led him to become Heisenberg. Not because he had cancer and wanted to pay for his treatments, but because he was too prideful to accept charity. Because of the fact that he wanted to take control, and again, this had to do with Skyler constantly controlling him. He wanted to be in control of his own destiny. He wanted the power. This is all about power. And that's what led him into the criminal underworld. That's what made him a crime lord, not some desire to pay for his medical treatment or to put up his family, which was just a bullshit excuse. He did it for him because he wanted the power. He wanted to control his own destiny. He wanted to be controlled. He didn't want to take handouts. That's what this show is all about, and that is why this episode defines the show. I will say it, yeah, this probably is the most important, not the best, mind you, but the most important episode of the entire show. More so than a pilot, it really defines what it's about and why. This is where his downfall begins. I mean, his rise to power, but his downfall, and as far as becoming a terrible human being. This is where it all starts. And it was driven by that power of those first 3 episodes where he said, I'm awake, or whatever. This show is really about the downfall of a decent human being. And this is where his spiral into becoming a sociopath really begins. So, in that light, that did make me appreciate this episode a lot more. Now, I don't think it's the best episode ever, mind you, but it is a damn good one, and probably the most important one for the show. So, let me get into the next episode, which is Crazy Handful of Nothing. Now, I did like this episode actually a lot better, but I have less to say about it. Because this was the transformation of Walter White into Heisenberg. This is where he shaved his head, and he adapted the classic look that's going to become so apparent
or iconic for the rest of the show. And it really is about his transformation, which began in the last episode, of becoming this immoral person. Is really diving into this criminal underworld. And I love how the analogy of the crazy handful of nothing, because they had the poker game where Walt wins by bluffing, and he had a crap hand, and the way Marie describes it as a handful of nothing. And it's kind of an analogy for what he does later on, where he bluffs Tuco. I mean, not really bluffs because he has exploding meth, but really he's not this like really violent person. And seeing his reaction of after like going through that experience with Tuco, of like just in this car like screaming and going crazy, like yeah, it's showing like he was completely lying and bluffing about being a badass. Basically, he was putting on a facade, and that's not who he was. He was just this high school suburban teacher, but eventually he will become. By the time we get to the 5th season, he will become this person that he's pretending to be in this episode. But in this episode, he's not him yet. He's still pretending to be him. But the more he pretends to be him, the more he actually will become him, which is, again, another fascinating dynamic. But then again, of course, we get the introduction of Tuco in this episode, and he beats the shit out of Jesse, which was a very, and I do think it does speak strongly to Walt's character that him seeing Jesse like that, he wants to do better. Because I think he does feel a bit guilty because he's the one who pushed Jesse. And again, this had to do with his ignorance of how the whole drug trade works. He was like, this is not good enough, this money you make, you have to do better, you have to sell them bulk. And Jesse tried to explain, like, it's not that easy, bitch, or whatever. But he wouldn't listen to him because he pushed him. That's what led Jesse to end up in the hospital, and like with fractured ribs, and really get like a severe beating. And so I think Walt did feel and it does speak to his character, I guess, that he felt guilty enough that he would risk his life to sort of avenge Jesse and get like some money for his pain and suffering. But of course it wasn't a totally selfless act. It was all about getting things set up so he could start earning all the bulk money that he's been wanting to earn from Tuco. But again, it should show how it's a really horrible idea to get involved with a man like Tuco, who did beat the shit out of his partner and try to steal his meth. And it's not a good place to start a relationship with having exploding meth that blows up the building. Like, you should realize that this is not an ideal situation. But, yeah, that was a damn good episode. So, we will get into the episode, which incidentally is the finale of season 1, which is totally doesn't read as obvious. It wasn't intended to be. A no rough stuff type deal. Now, this episode I wasn't a huge fan of, to be honest. It's not that, I don't know, I wouldn't say it was necessarily boring, because the stuff with Walt and Jesse having to deal with Tuco, and Walt's like, I'll sell you 4 pounds, and Jesse's like, Jesus Christ, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like, that stuff was kind of interesting. But most of the episode, to be honest, dealt with like the stuff with Marie and Hank, which I found kind of boring. Actually, when I first started watching this season just now, for this rewatch, for this review, I was like, as soon as Marie popped up, I was like, I really don't like this character. And I really don't like her. I suppose, hopefully she'll become more tolerable, or at least just used less later, but yeah, I really don't like her. And this episode dealt with her like shoplifting, and which is a storyline that really I could have done entirely without. It does seem, I'm sorry to use this term, but honestly I think this term fits the best. Filler. It's filler. It's there to fill up time. It doesn't really add anything to Walt's story. It doesn't really add anything to Skylar's story. And Marie is just kind of just a useless character. I'm sorry, but she is. And so I don't really care about her storyline. Her story doesn't add anything to the main story of the show. So I don't care that she has this stealing problem. And I have seen the show before, so I know that nothing will come of this. It's totally pointless, and it's just there to literally fill the runtime of the episode, basically. They didn't have enough story with the other Tuco stuff, or they wanted to drag it out longer, which, in retrospect, seeing how this is be the last episode of the season is a bad idea, that they should have maybe not done that, instead just focused more on the Walt and Jesse stuff. But I suppose when they were writing this episode, they thought there was going to be many more episodes in the season, or at least 6 more, so they wanted to drag things out. And it's filler. Completely unnecessary. And, yeah. So, this episode's okay, I guess. And as I said before, the way it ends was just like, really like, that's it? That's the end of the season? Like, I was looking for more episodes. Like, this can't be it. But again, that's not the writer's fault. It's, writer's strike, what you're going to do. And it had more to do with, like, Studio Network's decision to not bring it back to finish the rest of the season. To just wait till season 2, because it's not a popular enough show at this point in time. It's just the first season. As I said, most people didn't even watch the show till later. So, there you go. That is it for my coverage of season 1 of Breaking Bad. So I guess, as always, and want to do in these type of reviews, I'll name my favorite episode of the season and my least favorite episode of the season. Now, there's only 7 episodes, but still. Now, least favorite episode, I think, is obvious. I think I already mentioned it's Cancer Man. It remains to be seen if it will make my worst list of the entire show. If it does, that means there's not very many bad episodes in the entire show, because it's not a terrible episode. It's just boring as fuck. And complete, like, they really stretched this storyline out, and they really didn't need to. And we didn't need the whole Jesse thing with his family. I thought it was a complete waste of time. So, best episode of the season. That's hard. That's a harder one. It comes in between 2 episodes. I think I'm going to have to name the runner-up as the pilot. As much as I love this pilot, and I thought I stand by it could have been its own movie, but I'm glad it wasn't, because the show got even better as it kept going. It was a good way to start the show. But for best episode, I think I'm going to have to say Crazy Handful of Nothing. I think this is, I called Gray Matter the defining episode of the show, but also Crazy Handful of Nothing could also be seen as a defining episode, because this is when they first had this full transformation into Heisenberg. This is when they first said the name Heisenberg, and it really showed how, as I said, he was pretending to be this badass, and it will drive him to eventually become this badass. It was just a really, great story too, lots of turns with Jesse getting the shit beat out of him, and then Walt having to deal with going on the cancer treatment for the first time and having this alternate life where he's Heisenberg, basically. So that, I think, is the best episode of the season. So my rating for season 1 of Breaking Bad as a whole, I'm going to give this a 7. Very good. I think in the past I gave this a 6, but I think this is a bit too harsh. I think this is good enough as a 7. It has a set in retrospect, because I didn't really appreciate the episode Gray Matter as much before when I first saw it. But in retrospect, knowing what they do with the story and knowing how important it would be, I do appreciate it a lot more. The pilot, as I thought, was a great start to the entire show. And the next 2 episodes about the Cat in the Bag in the River. There's a really great follow-up that dealt with like the trauma Walt had to deal with actually cold-blooded murdering someone. And then the end of the season, you got more into Tuco stuff, which is interesting. But you had a lot of filler, particularly the Cancer Man episode. But still a decent, good season. So that's it for my review of Breaking Bad Season 1. As I said, I shall be back every month to cover a new season of Breaking Bad. So be sure to check out my channel for that. And also check out my channel as I cover many more shows like Discovery, all sorts of Star Trek shows, BoJack Horseman, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.